Everyone, the presentation is about to begin. This session will be recorded and will last approximately 60 minutes. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and turn off web cameras. If you have a question or comment, enter it in the chat during the presentations, and your question will be addressed by the presenters at the very end. If you're on a phone, you will be given an opportunity during the Q&A time to voice your questions and comments. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 2 to 3 business days after today's live event. TESOL International Association Second Language Writing Interest Section, in collaboration with the Second Language Writing Standing Group at SLWIS, is pleased to present this webinar titled Advocating for Multilingual Writers through Anti-Racist and Translingual Teaching and Administrative Practices. We are happy to welcome you all. I'm Sarah Henderson-Lee, the incoming chair for TESOL's Second Language Writing Interest Section, and my co-host today is Nora Fahim, co-chair of the Second Language Writing Standing Group at SLWIS. Before we get started, I want to quickly invite you all, here we go, follow our 2 groups on social media. Here you can find shared resources and invites to various second language writing related events, in addition to just a really awesome online professional community. Join us if you can. We're both on Facebook and Twitter, as you see on the slide. One upcoming event next month that I quickly want to share with you is the TESOL Second Language Writing Intersection Book Club discussion, which will be taking place on July 13th. We invite you to join this group. It'll be our second discussion of changing practices for L2 writing, for the L2 writing classroom, moving beyond the 5-paragraph essay, and we will have 4 of the authors with us, so do try to join us. Now I'll quickly hand it over to my co-host Nora, who will introduce today's presenters.
Sarah, would you kindly allow me to share my screen?
Yes.
All right, hello everyone. On behalf of the Second Language Writing Standing Group at the Conference on College Composition and Communication, we're really excited to have you with us today. It's a Friday for some of you later in the afternoon, and for those of you joining us internationally, perhaps the evening. So to get us started today, I would like to introduce our presenters who are from the Second Language Writing Standing Group. So I'm just going to share my screen over here. Could I have a thumbs up, Sarah, if you see my screen? All right. We have Missy Watson with us from the City College of New York. Her co-presenter is Rachel Jiaojie from Purdue, as well as Ming Fang from Florida International University. We are aiming for each talk to be about 15 minutes, with the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So our first talk is Applying Anti-Racist and Decolonial Approaches, Contesting Monolinguist Ideologies. And to present for us today, we have Missy. So Missy, I am going to stop my share to help you go ahead and share your screen. Oops, sorry, 1 second. I'm afraid, Nancy, can you?
Usually if you go look at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a link that says stop screen sharing.
Oh, yeah.
So it won't be on the PowerPoint, it'll be on the larger screen.
Because it disappeared for a moment. All right, excited to hear what you have today.
Let's see. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, Nora, yeah, okay. The title of this talk is Applying Anti-Racist and Decolonial Approaches to Contesting Monolingualist Ideologies. And please note that you can access this presentation script and slides at the URLs listed in the chat function or on this slide. I'm Missy Watson, Assistant Professor at City College of New York, part of the CUNY system. And while I'll be the one doing the talking in this portion of today's webinar, this presentation was collaboratively written by, with my colleague, Dr. Rachel Shapiro, who couldn't be here today. And in what follows, Rachel and I argue the importance of understanding monolingualist ideologies as racist ideologies. And we discuss strategies for unveiling and contesting monolingualism in and through our teaching. Such a goal, we believe, is particularly important for developing an anti-racist approach when teaching. with the ongoing police killings of unarmed Black men and women in the United States, we are being called once again to acknowledge our collective racial wounds and to take accountability and action, including for the ways that our teaching practices are shaped by and participate in shaping our nation's racist systems. Now more than ever, collective efforts in anti-racist teaching are needed. Teachers of multilingual students are accustomed to focusing on language practices and processes in our instruction. It's an essential part of what we do. Rachel and I argue, however, that we need to likewise incorporate investigations of language ideologies and political histories. That is, with students, we need to examine and grapple with the racist language ideologies and colonizing histories that in the first place have worked to exclude and subjugate language difference. And this, we argue, is one way to build toward more anti-racist and decolonial teaching. No matter our disciplinary backgrounds and interests, I know that many of us who teach English language and literacy share in the goal of contesting monolingualist ideology. But let's explore the monolingual paradigm a bit, as well as its connections with racism. Later, we'll discuss how we might guide students to investigate these very ideologies and the political histories that have built them. Monolingualism is a harmful and multifaceted ideological paradigm. It manifests as English-only policies, tacit or explicit, as standard language ideology, as presumptions that our students are linguistically homogeneous, as misconceptions of language as pure and static in other ways. Monolingualist ideologies do not remain at the ideological level. Rather, they result in material consequences. At its worst, monolingualist ideologies can lead and have historically led to a silencing and even eradication of languages and varieties, tons of them, as well as brutal penalization of speakers of non-prestige languages. At their best, monolingualist ideologies devalue languages and the speakers who sustain them. Consider also the extra layers of financial and academic costs linguistically diverse students face in higher education, such as inflated tuition and exam fees, non-credit bearing, remedial writing classes, tutoring services, or required attendance at the institution's affiliated language institute. This is all in addition to the immeasurable affective weight language minoritized students face when working within a system that's not designed for, yet actively recruits and ineffectively accommodates them. Monolingualism also works to racialize, marginalize, and recolonize non-white, non-standard, and non-native English speakers, marking their languages as deficient, their differences as error, incompetence, and as Suresh Kanagraja put it, evidence of their alienation. Systemically in the US, monolingualism has served the project of racism, colonization, and nation building, fueling stereotypes about the look and character of US insiderness and hence outsiderness. And as we know, systemic forces of oppression result in significant socioeconomic inequalities. Language oppression is merely one force within this system. As Ellen Cushman puts it, the primacy of English in composition studies in classrooms at its very heart maintains an imperialist legacy that dehumanizes everyone in different and differing ways. But so many of us inevitably ask, but can't English teaching level the playing field? Past efforts to quote unquote help speakers of non-standard languages and dialects to dodge exclusion and dodge racism has led to an inaccurate and problematic uptake of the linguistic concept of code switching, as Roshana Shanti-Young has theorized. Rather than understanding, valuing, and including students' learned abilities to, code switch across languages, dialects, and registers, the theory of code switching has been misapplied instead to tell students to just switch on their standard English and switch off their other language differences, as if that were a possible, advantageous, neutral, or raceless expectation. This takes the systemic problem of linguistic and racial injustice and burdens students with the responsibility to change their language to change themselves. But as Bruce Horner and John Trimber and others remind us, language provides no guarantee of upward mobility. The determining factors are instead intersectional and include identity markers like race, gender, class, ability, and age. And as April Baker Bell recently put it, if y'all actually believe that using standard English will dismantle white supremacy, then you're not paying attention. She goes on to say that if we as teachers truly believe that code switching will dismantle white supremacy, we have a problem. If we honestly believe that code switching will save Black people's lives, then we really ain't paying attention to what's happening in the world. Eric Garner was choked to death by a police officer while saying, "I cannot breathe." Wouldn't you consider "I cannot breathe" standard English syntax? We're in the business of teaching standard English language and literacy. If standard language won't save our students or Black people or anyone, what can we do about this in and through our writing pedagogies? It may feel overwhelming, right, to contend with the linkages of racism and language in our classrooms, but for the remainder of our talk, we would like to offer some strategies that can help us begin developing our own pedagogies in ways that work toward racial and linguistic justice. And the first approach is naming and reflecting on racism in our teaching. When our teaching or scholarship focuses on language issues without naming race, it is not because race is not a significant factor, but because its significance has been overlooked or obscured. Thus, the first strategy we recommend toward anti-racist teaching, as critical race theorists have long called us to do, is to name race in our teaching, to examine it, how it functions, and to explore ways of pushing back. So here it's just a sampling of just 3 questions that we might pose to ourselves and grapple with. How are we avoiding racial terminology, including race and white language supremacy, when we address language teaching and language politics in our courses? How is our instruction or feedback on writing and language influenced by the racializing forces of standard language ideology? How can we shape our teaching to acknowledge, honor, and respond to the very different languages and experiences of speakers who represent a variety of racial and other positionalities? This reflective groundwork is essential to achieving anti-racist values. We act against racist language ideologies in our pedagogies when we are more intentional about practices, including just our use of terms. For instance, consider the different critical conversations that may emerge when we refer to so-called standard English as standardized English, or even as white English. Doing so, we take on the hidden curriculum of the racist monolingualist ideologies undergirding our pedagogies. And of course, reflection can only be a starting point. We further need to apply these perspectives through specific strategies in the classroom. And I'll talk about some, and I know my panelists will be talking about other classroom strategies and beyond. Our second recommended approach then is to design certain pedagogical strategies that aim to contest monolingualism, racism, and colonialism. And again, we call for extending our focus in teaching on language processes and practices to better include a focus on language ideologies and political histories. As one method, we suggest working with students through dialogue, readings, and research to unveil and work to contest these language politics. The first strategy we offer for detaching monolingualism from our language work is to trace with students some of the racist ideologies and colonizing histories within specific localized moments of language contact. We can start, for instance, with students' own experiences with language in order to ground our examinations in the personal. US multilingual students, domestic and international, and college writing courses might explore one of their own experiences being taught English or standardized English or penalized for their language uses. Students learning English as a foreign language in their home countries might explore local language policies as well as the global politics of English's dominance, while multilingual graduate students in the US and elsewhere might investigate the dominance of English in academic publication. Of course, not all examples will present the same levels of difference and oppression, and that's a welcome challenge of this work, to uncover the uneven language experiences we have and the ever more varied consequences we face, depending on the context and our intersectional identities. A second related strategy might include similar critical tracings of harmful language ideologies, racism, and colonialism, but within specific historical examples of linguistic oppression and resistance. So in a US context, for instance, students might research the history of the Carlisle Indian schools in which Native children were stripped of their language, their very names, in order to, quote, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Through such investigations, students might trace how the US government used education and literacy to delegitimize the language practices of Indigenous people and justify their colonization. Historical moments can further be identified and examined as sites of resistance in which Indigenous and other peoples use their linguistic and literate agencies to rebel and exercise their own self-making. A third strategy would be for students and teachers to critically observe and respond to ways that racist and colonizing ideologies like white language supremacy directly affect the choices we make when we speak and we write. This may be particularly fruitful if applied during students' writing processes. For instance, as Bruce Horner and Sarah Alvarez encourage, we could invite students to pause and reflect on and really grapple with the extent to which they themselves are perceiving a certain audience, or perhaps a white US audience, and their expectations for what clear, effective, and appropriate communication looks like, and what other than linguistic repertoires get excluded as a result. So really paying attention in that process. The work of noticing audience expectations can be done through readings, class discussions, one-on-one negotiations, as well as before, while, and after students write. Thus, through this strategy, students and teachers might come to see how non-linguistic cultural norms, values, and rules shape and affect our day-to-day language practices. Students, of course, already bring with them varied and sophisticated understandings of their own language choices across contexts and their experiences navigating social and racial pressures as well. So this strategy calls for tapping into that. The fourth and final strategy that we call for is to use language more explicitly to contest monolingualist norms. And this strategy reflects the overt cross-language work that some teachers taking a translingual approach have explored, including invitations for students to make their code meshing strategies visibly manifest in their academic writing. And it's widely agreed upon that students should not be forced to draw on their different and often minoritized languages simply for the sake of inviting language difference into academic writing contexts. Such an approach risks not only exoticizing students and their languages, but also risks overstepping linguistic and identity boundaries that students themselves may have purposely built. So this fourth strategy should instead cultivate more optimal conditions for students to make their own critical decisions about contesting writing and discursive norms. But what's important here is that they're doing so fully informed about the monolingualist, racist, and colonizing ideologies shaping their context. Essentially, Rachel and I are encouraging teachers to examine and contest with students the often racist and colonial attitudes and policies on language that undergird our experiences and the systems in which we work. This work is undeniably challenging and political, and it requires additional labor, not to mention the complicated, varied, and uneven emotional burdens and potential triggers that such work holds for students and teachers. And so we recognize the ways that different teaching contexts also will be more conducive than others when it comes to applying the strategies we call for. They might not fit everywhere in the same ways. We thus find ourselves being cautious not to prescribe one kind of political and ideological student-teacher work. And I'd love to hear what folks are doing in their different contexts. But we do believe that every teacher, no matter their context, should actively and critically scrutinize their pedagogical practices, their institutions, and larger systems with the explicit aim to uncover the inevitable influence of monolingualism, racism, and colonialism. And our hope is that such ongoing ideologically driven inquiry alongside students' increased awareness of the intersections of these language politics may work to further loosen the grip that monolingualist ideologies have on institutions and society today. Thank you. And I have there Rachel's and my email addresses, which will be available on the slides that were shared in the link. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Missy. So we have our next speaker coming up. I'll just briefly share my screen. So up next we have Jiaoji from Purdue University, and he'll be sharing with us redesigning the writing classroom from a translingual perspective. So on to you, Jiaoji.
Thank you, Nora.
All right, you should have the screen now.
All right.
Great, we can see your screen.
Perfect. Hello, friends and colleagues at TESOL. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Zhaozhe Wang, and I'm a PhD candidate at Purdue University. MISI just provided an accessible way of understanding monolingualism and colorblind racism, and offered us concrete strategies for dealing with in our classroom and the writing center. I would like to zoom in on classroom practices and talk about how to redesign our multilingual writing classroom from a translingual perspective. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll be briefly discussing the persistent linguicism that's embedded in our administrative and pedagogical practices. Then I'll be introducing general guidelines in incorporating translingual strategies or elements into our multilingual writing curriculum, which has the potential of combating linguicism. Specifically, these are some of the pedagogical aspects that I plan to touch upon. For example, select course readings, supervise discussions, conferencing, design assignments, and respond to and assess student writing. So please note that this is meant to be a general guideline on a still evolving and sometimes quite contentious approach. And in the interest of time, I won't go into detail about each guideline or strategy, but I'd be happy to explore them with you together during the Q&A session. All right, so I would like to begin with a little bit of a socio-political context. A recent NAFSA, National Association of Foreign Student Advisors, report published in May last year presents a disturbing trend. The report noted a 6.6 decline in new international student enrollments, and this follows a 3.3% decline in new enrollments the prior year and marks the first time America has seen a 2-year decline. Here's a more concerning finding. Data show that international students and scholars feel less safe and less welcome in the United States than the previous years surveyed, and that university and industry leaders acknowledge that anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies contribute to a chilling effect on international study in the US. Within this overtly xenophobic environment, linguistic differences manifested in international multilingual writers' literacy practices become an easy target of linguicism, which refers to the ideology that languages are of unequal value, and the structure used to legitimize unequal division of resources on the basis of language. So in the writing classroom, for example, multilingual writers' unconventional use of English is called out as deviations from the norm or outright incorrect and subsequently graded favorably. In other social and organizational spaces on campus, the lack of English proficiency or use of other varieties of English may be perceived as lack of intelligence by their native English-speaking counterparts. So linguicism is not only ideological and attitudinal, but also felt bodily and experienced daily by our multilingual students. To combat this persistent linguicism in the writing classroom, scholars in writing studies have been committed to theorizing a translingual approach to writing and teaching writing. Although there's been a strong resistance to this allegedly trendy movement from the broader TESOL community, as well as concerns with its applicability in the classroom, there's been growing curiosity as well, as we may have noticed, that translingual scholarship has found its way into the mainstream TESOL publishing and conference venues. So what is translingualism? I see it as an ideology, orientation, disposition, approach, practice, and phenomena or rhetoric that treats one's language not as discrete entities, but as available codes in a repertoire, assumes that language is performative and always in contact with diverse semiotic resources and generating new meanings, and sees language difference as a resource for meaning making, negotiates purposeful textual practices such as code matching as convention and context transforming. So as you can see, this term is quite loaded and open to interpretation. So what I would like to emphasize is that the translingual guidelines I'm about to introduce only represent my take on it. So please take them with a grain of salt. So first of all, let's talk about what it means to integrate translingualism in our writing curriculum as a syllabus approach. For the general structure, I would recommend a process approach, meaning we allow multiple drafts and revisions. Sequence assignments could be implemented to allow for sustained and extended negotiation between instructors and students. We would want to highlight students' linguistic and cultural resources that they bring to the class. So literacy autobiography could be emphasized as a focal assignment to inspire students to explore the linguistic and cultural repertoire that embodies their identities. When it comes to conferencing, I recommend that it take place during the brainstorming phase, reading and discussing phase, drafting phase, writing and revising phase, and reflecting phase. We should pay particular attention to students' rationale for certain rhetorical moves that may be considered different and allow students to negotiate meaning. For class discussions, we may prompt students to research and talk about writing conventions in their home contexts. Course readings should cover texts written in and or about different linguistic and cultural contexts. I've prepared an extensive reading list, and I'd be happy to send to you via email if you're interested. So please feel free to reach out afterwards. What if you're not sure about revamping your course and just want to experiment with translingualism as a topic or a theme? Now the purpose has somewhat changed, right? We may want to introduce translingualism in our classroom as a subject matter, meaning it's more of a class about translingualism than it's a class built on translingualism. Well, what's the benefit of it? I think having multilingual students directly engaged with the growing scholarship on translingualism is a productive way to get them to critically re-examine constructs like standard English or the idea of writing like a native speaker. The ultimate goal is to provide them with a heuristic to work with language difference. That said, readings should be carefully chosen from the scholarship on translingual writing to represent the full scope of the scholarly discussion. For example, the origin, development, debate, pedagogical practices of and about translingual writing. Class discussions could begin with apparent differences in language and then transition to less apparent rhetorical and discursive differences. As for assignments, we need to treat them as sites for translingual negotiation between the student and the instructor. We could also prompt students to reflect on their own translingual identity. I know many of us still have lots of reservations about this so-called translingualism and would only feel comfortable trying it in the form of an assignment. So that's absolutely fine. We've got to start somewhere. The genre of the assignment, I recommend literacy autobiography or autoethnography because they are an optimal genre for a translingual writing assignment, as it prompts students to reflect on the advantage of mobilizing their own linguistic and cultural resources in a new rhetorical situation. We should allow plenty of time for students to reflect on and negotiate how they deploy and manipulate their linguistic and cultural resources, either in the form of a post-assignment reflection or during conferences. Kernan, Meyer, and Wang introduced a translation assignment that suits this purpose perfectly. For example, in their article, they illustrated 3 types of this assignment. First step is to have students perform individual translation, meaning students translate the text written in the student's home language into English and provide explanation. Then students are directed to do a comparative analysis where group members who translated the same text compare their translations and negotiate meanings. When these first 2 steps are done, students will write a narrative reflecting on their translation processes. Our multilingual writers do a whole lot of subconscious translation work anyway when they write in their second language. So this assignment highlights this mental process and makes it explicit. This way, students will have the opportunity to visualize how their peers write across language differently than themselves, and ultimately develop a more nuanced understanding of language difference. Okay, so how do we respond to students' writing when taking a translingual approach? The guiding principle is we as teachers should be willing to negotiate with students. For example, we should approach unconventional use of English as sites of negotiation rather than mark it as poor practice or error. Practice using questions instead of statements to create space for negotiation when noticing unconventional practice of English. This requires us to always assume that students make certain rhetorical and linguistic moves intentionally to achieve certain purposes. When we are interrupted by practice of code meshing or code mixing that involve the use of languages other than English, we should suggest using footnotes and clarification techniques to facilitate understanding. A lot of translingual practices are manifested at the lexical level. We should be careful not to be too liberal when translingual writing is used as an excuse to account for other global issues in student writing, such as coherence and organization. Our feedback should invite students to fully unpack any unfamiliar use of English as a means to build rapport with their audience. And last but not least, when we offer feedback, we should not neglect the potential rhetorical context that the student is likely to transfer their writing skills to. Now let's move on to the most disputed territory, assessment. Assessing student writing within a translingual paradigm calls for special attention to what to assess, as well as how to assess it. And this means a revamp of the assessment rubrics from a traditional monolingual paradigm. When designing assessment rubrics, we should be cautious when using terms such as standard written English and grammatical mistakes, because these constructs represent a monolingual ideology. If you do need to use these phrases, clearly define this construct within a translingual paradigm. When talking about translingual writing, a common myth is that we should let language issues slide. No, language use should not be completely neglected in these rubrics, because it would do our developing student writers a disservice. Instead, language use and students' ability to justify their language use should be highlighted. Assessment should not focus only on students' written products, but should also be implemented during the composing and negotiating processes. And also, we should emphasize the context as well as students' ability to analyze, adapt to, and transform context in the rubric. This is my take on assessing student writing from a translingual perspective. So what I just offered is to borrow a Chinese idiom, 走马观花, flower viewing from horseback type of introduction, where I was trying to be comprehensive as opposed to in-depth. So if you're interested in further discussion or would like a copy of the reading list, please reach me at dr.wang@purdue.edu, and we'll go from there. Thank you for your attention, and let me pass the mic to Ming, who's going to talk about faculty professional development.
Thank you, Zhaozhi. We got some excellent comments and suggestions in the chat, which we'll be sure to address. I will briefly introduce Ming, who will be our final speaker for today. So Ming's topic will be developing adaptive expertise on translingual pedagogies through faculty development. So I give it back to you, Ming.
Thank you, Nora. And hello, everybody. Thanks, Zhaozhi and Missy, for sharing your perspectives. So let me share my screen. All right. So my name is Ming Fan, and I'm a senior instructor in the English department at Florida International University. I have a background in teaching first-year writing and supporting faculty development in multilingual writing pedagogies, as well as writing across the curriculum. Different from the previous two presenters, I'm approaching the theme of this webinar with a faculty development focus. So first, the importance of faculty professional development, as it is set here, faculty development is key to academic vitality, program growth, and change. So ever since I joined our writing and rhetoric program in 2012, I have seen ongoing professional development in our program. So this presentation is also my own reflective analysis of our program's professional development. So let me first introduce the basic construct that I will be using for my reflective analysis here. So routine expertise and adaptive expertise. So first, let's look at the routine expert. The routine expert is adept at handling the everyday procedures of teaching, but these procedures have become optimized over time. So I'm taking Hanado and Inagaki's routine expertise and adaptive expertise framework here. And also, routine experts learn merely to perform a skill faster and more accurately without constructing or enriching their conceptual knowledge. Whereas the adaptive expert can make adaptations in teaching, including diversified scaffolding, tweaking lessons, tailoring instruction to learners' needs, testing new strategies, and redesigning curriculum. Adapting instruction thoughtfully is also a feature of successful teaching. So for instance, with the current COVID-19 situation, I think you all have that kind of experience. We have all been forced to adapt to the online or remote teaching. So online or remote teaching is not necessarily in our routine expertise, right? So we need to develop adaptive expertise to respond to that context. So there has been a growing acceptance that adaptive expertise is a good lens in which to view teaching and teacher development. So for instance, Herbola in a very recent article proposes adaptive expertise as an analytical lens for L2 writing teacher education. So I'm adopting the same lens to look at faculty development. Most of our faculty in the writing and rhetoric program, they do not have formal training in teaching multilingual students or translingual pedagogies. So although they may have routine expertise in teaching writing, working with multilingual students, or taking a translingual disposition is likely in the domain of the adaptive expertise. So what constitutes expertise in teaching multilingual students? I think at least we should consider dispositions, knowledge, and practices. And I will be talking about those three categories. So as I see it, our faculty development takes different stages. So let me briefly introduce some of the activities in those different stages. So earlier on, we have some major professional development activities, including hosting workshops, developing online training modules, providing curriculum resources, all explicitly on serving the needs of our multilingual students. So for instance, some of the workshops were on understanding errors in students' writing, a translingual approach to first-year writing, and the curriculum resources, including resources on managing lower order concerns of students' writing, texts on translingual rhetoric or texts written by writers who constantly work across language and identity boundaries. And later on, we linked our professional development with the first year curriculum redesign. The later stage professional development included extended workshops, reading groups, a new curriculum working group. We have faculty members piloting course material, and we also have teaching circles. So there are more faculty collaborations. The later stage of faculty development does not exclusively focus on supporting multilingual students. However, some of our faculty take the opportunity to kind of further develop their adaptive expertise working with multilingual students using translingual pedagogy. So how have these professional development activities helped faculty develop adaptive expertise? So first, for dispositions, through these activities, faculty have realized that multilingual students are not a homogeneous group. There's a move away from perceiving students' home language as a barrier or deficit trait of our multilingual students. There's a greater awareness of the need for students to develop their basic academic literacy skills, and also generally a greater tolerance towards students' writing accents and various forms of deviations from standard English. And also later on, with greater emphasis on students' retention issues in our professional development activities, faculty also recognize that support for multilingual students should go beyond simply supporting their academic literacy development. So there's a need to, say, cultivate a strong sense of belonging, encouraging self-regulation, so on and so forth. So in terms of the knowledge domain, in the earlier stage, faculty members were exposed to L2 feedback scholarship, second language acquisition, translingual practice, language differences, and later on, with our university's priority on student success and retention, faculty members were also exposed to retention scholarship, especially linguistic minority students' retention issues, rhetorical sensibility, and culturally relevant teaching. So in terms of the practices, I think our faculty has adopted some of the teaching strategies that Zhao Zhe was mentioning earlier in his part of this talk. So faculty's growing expertise also shows in various practices. So in the earlier stage with professional development workshops on giving feedback, supporting language development needs of multilingual students, faculty were able to extend their teaching strategies in conferencing, giving more focused feedback and modifying reading and writing tasks that would allow students to actually explore their lived experience in translingual contact zones. And later on, faculty were working on strengths-based curriculum with more translingual and transmodal projects with contents directly related to writing, rhetoric, language diversity, and learning. Some faculty also adopted direct instruction regarding language difference and linguistic diversity. Considering our Miami local context, this is truly meaningful. For most of our students, speaking or encountering a combination of multiple forms of Englishes and Spanishes is their everyday lived experience. What is also worth noting is that the growing expertise does not necessarily translate into a unified implementation in practice. As set here in a forthcoming collection on translingual pedagogical perspectives, a translingual disposition resists simple definition and straightforward implementation. So we noticed this agentive adaptation of faculty. So each of our faculty's personal and professional interests strongly influence which assignment they thought were meaningful and which translingual principles they value the most. So enacting translingual pedagogies in writing instruction does not simply mean explicitly teaching linguistic diversity or language difference, an area that not all writing instructors feel competent or interested in teaching. So to give you several examples, we have faculty member who encourage students to take critical theory as a lens to examine social injustice issues and interrogating power dynamic within the immigrant discourse community that students they themselves are part of. We also have faculty members using writing texts as a kind of heuristic to raise students' awareness of the translingual contact zone with which they live every day. And also we have some other faculty members explicitly promote language diversity and raise students' awareness of the contested privilege of standard English. However, we also see this unity in diversity. So despite the different implementations, there are also marked shared tenets that all support translingual pedagogies, including holding diversity as a norm, creating opportunities for linguistic negotiation, and encouraging rhetorical dexterity. So the final thoughts about the three key terms in my presentation. Our program will continue faculty development. So as one of the program administrators who have been heavily engaged in our faculty development, I hope our professional development helps to further reconceptualize the expertise of teaching and writing, especially in our local context with linguistic diversity and translingual contact. And based on that reconceptualization, we may decide a set of objectives that could be the focus of the professional development for translingual pedagogies. For instance, strategies for engaging students in translingual activity, soliciting students' reflective understandings about their own translanguaging practices. I also envision that through various professional development opportunities, faculty's adaptive expertise grows, which help them to better enact translingual pedagogies. By the way, I probably should have clarified that I refer to translingual pedagogies in a quite capacious sense to encapsulate a broad range of pedagogies that challenging the monolingual ideologies that Missy mentioned earlier. And finally, by practicing translingual pedagogies, faculty can also further enhance their adaptive expertise. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm sharing my references here, and I will be happy to share the slides as well, so feel free to reach out. All right. So I will give it back to Nora.
I think Sarah can now.
Yeah, so I want to just take a quick moment to thank all of our presenters for sharing their work on this topic and to take us into a quick Q&A. We've had a couple of questions come up in the chat box. I know one of the most recent ones was directed at Ming. Since she was just talking, I'll give it to her. The question was, Ming, do you have any experience with faculty coaching or skill building in this domain?
I forgot to unmute myself. So Sarah, just for me to kind of better understand the question is asking like do I have any like personal expertise?
Yes, that's correct. Regarding
okay.
Faculty coaching in this area.
Okay. My background is actually in second language writing or multilingual writing. I guess one of the reasons that my program hired me was that I have this kind of background. So at that time, our program got a grant to support or to improve the teaching of multilingual students and 1.5 generation students. So I do have a kind of background in multilingual writing, in second language writing. But in terms of, if you are asking about the coaching skills, that's the skills that I'm learning on the job.
Yeah, I think the question came from Michelle, so I'm not sure what was, maybe she can unmute and clarify.
Yeah, I guess my question really is, you know, how much of it is there a trend in terms of coaching as opposed to lecturing or informing instructors, meaning that it is a developmental process to move from a position of not teaching in this way to teaching in a new way, that it will take time as opposed to a single workshop, and just wondering about that.
Yeah, it definitely takes more than one workshop. It's a consistent effort. I would say for the first part of the training that we train faculty members to work with multilingual students, that training was exclusively focused on working with multilingual students, and that training takes about like 5 years. So we have like a 5 years program.
Awesome. Thank you.
We've also had some earlier questions for Jiaozhe and Missy's talk, so we want to be sure. I know we need to scroll quite a bit up, but if anyone would like to speak out their question, you could also do that.
I think we had one from Maha during Jiaozhe's talk.
Yes.
I can read it, but feel free to unmute.
Is Maha here? Maybe you could read it for now.
Yeah, the question stated, Kanagaraj has suggested 4 strategies for translingual writing in the classroom, especially for expressive writing. How could you relate this in terms of your talk? How can invoicing through writing reinforce identity and interests among students in your classes?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Expressive writing. So I have, so in my writing classes, I haven't had the luxury to experiment with a full-scale translingual writing course, depending on how you would like to define a full translingual course. But I would say I incorporated translingualism as a class theme multiple times over the past 5 years. And so by incorporating translingualism as a class theme, I mean, I like class discussions on translingualism as a subject matter, and encouraged students to reflect on their own translingual experiences. So, and that reflection part was done in the form of a type of expressive writing where students, you know, collect artifacts from their previous literacy history and analyze those artifacts and, you know, go from there and, you know, relate their analysis to the translingual scholarship. So, for example, for some of the ratings that I used Ninja Lu's Canable 2 anecdote, as well as Kanagaraj's Botena example, and had my multilingual students discuss what it means to challenge the notion of standard English. So I would say a lot of insights and interesting stories came out of the discussion, you know, where my students shared why some of them are constantly under the pressure of speaking flawless English, while you know, others never really bothered to do so, and how these readings gave them a legitimate reason to sort of feel proud of their imperfect English. So yeah, I would say that's how the, what can I say, Translingual used as a class theme helped my students to sort of take a new perspective or approach expressive writing in a different way. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I noted one question that came in during Missy's talk, and I think there's been some additional related conversation in the chat. It reads, as an adult educator, ESL, and heritage language teacher, I wonder how we can help our learners on the path to success in today's society without upholding or perpetuating the power structure, and to work towards more equitable future, a more equitable future at the same time.
Great question. Thank you. I think the bottom line is we can't. We are absolutely upholding and perpetuating power structures inevitably through our teaching. And in fact, Shauna Shapiro, who I believe is on this call, and some of our other colleagues are just finishing up a publication that Nora is also aware of as editor for the journal. And it's about what it means to deal with the fact that our pedagogies, so long as they're within institutions that uphold linguistic and racial hierarchies, we're working against systems that are really hard to shake, that are centuries deep. So it's, I think, and I really appreciate the term anti-racist for that. It's not racist. It's anti-racist. It's going against it. It's trying to push back. And so I think without getting too disappointed about it or kind of losing optimism and excitement for our work, I think we have to acknowledge that there's so much stacked against our pedagogies and our students and the world and people in the world right now. And that doesn't mean we throw our hands up and give up, but we acknowledge the struggle and find ways to work against it.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Nora, did you have one identified, or do we want to let someone unmute?
One came in just now from Beta. Beta, are you with us, or shall I read the question? I can read it. An anti-racist approach to teaching English needs to start with dismantling the status quo and the hiring system that favors white monolingual and NES teachers of English and teacher trainers. What students of color need is not so much more education about their long history of oppression, but equal opportunities and access to the jobs as their white counterparts. How do we help level the playing field in the job market for our students of color? Excellent question. Please, would any of our speakers like to share something? Or I don't know if we can open it up even more, but.
It's the question from Beta, right? I just want to make sure I have the right question.
Yes.
Okay. Look at it. Right, and I think that Kevin Depew is also getting at this, that, I mean, I struggled with this with myself, I'm like, do I just need to just get the hell out of academia and just go fight? Or even within academia, as Kevin Depew is saying, like work much more at the institutional level. And so I think it's important to recognize that our presentations are talking to instructors about what we can do in our everyday classrooms, as well as administrators as far as what we can do with teacher training. But I absolutely think there are just a ton of other things we should be doing. We should actually be involved in our communities and what's going on. I mean, so much of what we even talk about stays in academia, right? So trying to make more public what it is that we're finding after 60 years of research on linguistic, differences and the injustices that evolved from there. Like, how can we make that a little bit more, within popular, culture and get more awareness? I think that's a major challenge. And I think absolutely in dismantling systems as much as we can, right? And also hiring more diversely, hiring folks that are linguistically diverse and racially diverse and diverse in all other ways. I think that's a big goal. I want to see, I'm reading the rest of the question. Right, and then specifically in the job market, I think so much of it is just is that larger social change that needs to be chipped away at, but we can work with others and develop committees and find ways to, I think, really train and inform folks in our field and beyond for best practices. Like I think about even just in my institution where I'm one of 3 composition and rhetoric specialists and one of 2 that deal with second language writing. And so, you know, making sure, I mean, the people that hire me might not have best practices at all for what to be, you know, looking for. And so I think specific to our disciplines, we need some best practices and some statements on that. And then also just in general, we should be fighting a lot more seriously for a more diverse faculty, and certainly with that hiring in mind.
Thank you, Missy. And with that, we're going to have to conclude today's webinar. I want to give a big thank you to all of our presenters. The collaboration between these 2 groups and TESOL NCs has been outstanding, and I look forward to future collaborations. Again, you will receive an email sometime next week with a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as any additional resources that we can put together from today's presentation to attach to that email. You're also welcome to contact any of us. Thank you for being here. Take care.
Thank you.